Good morning, this is Environmental Intelligence, Episode 14. It's March 25th, 2026, your daily briefing on environmental regulatory, science, and compliance developments that matter for Canadian professionals. Ontario's decision to sit out the federal Ring of Fire impact assessment has created immediate and tangible regulatory uncertainty for mining proponents operating in Northern Ontario. The executive summary is straightforward. Ontario did not participate in the preparation of the interim report on Ring of Fire development impacts produced jointly by participating First Nations and the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada. This absence raises serious questions about the practical realities of provincial-federal coordination under the Impact Assessment Act, particularly for one of the largest undeveloped mineral districts in the country. For years, large-scale northern development assessments in Ontario have relied on coordinated federal-provincial tables to align baseline data, mitigation expectations, and approval timelines. The current exclusion fundamentally changes that procedural baseline. It increases the risk of misalignment between federal IA decisions and the provincial approvals required under Ontario's Environmental Assessment Act and Mining Act. For contaminated sites and remediation practitioners supporting mining projects in the region, this matters immediately. Federal baseline data and mitigation requirements on water quality, species at risk, and cumulative effects may now diverge from what provincial ministries will ultimately accept. Consultants should anticipate additional coordination steps, supplemental studies, or even parallel technical reviews when submitting provincial permits or mine closure plans that reference the federal assessment. My take is that this represents more than a simple procedural oversight. It signals a deeper tension in how resource development priorities are being balanced between Queen's Park and Ottawa. Practitioners would be wise to treat the interim report as an influential document even in the absence of formal provincial endorsement. Next steps include close monitoring of how Ontario responds to the interim report over the coming weeks. Practitioners should also watch whether this situation triggers formal consultation or dispute resolution mechanisms between the two levels of government. What this ultimately signals is a material shift in how federal and provincial processes are aligning or failing to align on major resource projects in Northern Ontario. This theme of regulatory realignment continues as we move west. British column. BIA has formally disbanded its Clean BC Climate Agency, with some staff reportedly redirected to pipeline-related regulatory work. This represents a significant restructuring of provincial climate policy machinery under the Environmental Management Act and associated climate frameworks. The move will likely slow the development, updating, and enforcement of provincial climate regulations and carbon reduction requirements that have become increasingly detailed over the past several years. These requirements frequently intersect with contaminated sites work, remediation projects, and major energy infrastructure approvals across the province. Pipeline and oil sands practitioners in British Columbia should expect altered regulatory contacts and a potential reprioritization of climate adaptation and greenhouse gas management requirements within project approvals and permitting. From my perspective, this change reflects a broader provincial recalibration of priorities that places greater emphasis on economic enabling infrastructure while de-emphasizing standalone climate policy capacity. The practical implication for consultants is that climate-related commitments made in previous environmental assessments or permitting conditions may now be subject to different scrutiny or enforcement approaches going forward. This ties directly into the broader theme of regulatory realignment we are observing this week across multiple jurisdictions. Turning to science and technical developments with direct practice implications. Scientists have confirmed that the majority of microplastics found in forest soils arrive via atmospheric deposition rather than direct land-based sources. These particles settle on treetops and are subsequently transferred to the forest floor through rainfall, throughfall, and leaf litter. Natural processes such as leaf decay and soil development then progressively bury and store these particles in distinct soil layers over time. This has practical significance for site assessments involving forested properties, especially where background concentrations of synthetic particles must be carefully distinguished from site-specific contamination. The distinction is often required under provincial frameworks such as the BC Contaminated Sites Regulation or Ontario's OREG 15304 when establishing risk-based remedial targets. Practitioners should consider atmospheric deposition pathways explicitly when designing background sampling plans for remote or forested contaminated sites. My take is that this study reinforces the need for more sophisticated forensic approaches in environmental site assessments, particularly as regulators and courts continue to demand clearer lines between anthropogenic background and project-specific liability. A separate study finds that most people significantly misjudge the environmental impact of different food types. Individuals consistently underestimate the impact of beef while overestimating that of many processed foods and nuts. This misperception typically occurs when people rely on overly simplistic animal versus plant categorization rather than full life cycle data. The findings highlight the limitations of broad brush thinking in life cycle assessment and communication. While not directly regulatory, this has indirect implications for corporate ESG reporting, particularly where companies make public claims about sustainable supply chains or Scope 3 emissions. It also affects land use considerations in agricultural contaminated sites undergoing remediation and redevelopment, where future site use may involve food production or agribusiness. Senior practitioners should recognize that public and stakeholder understanding of environmental impacts is often based on incomplete information, which can influence expectations around site redevelopment and long-term stewardship. In industry and practice updates, the Trump administration is moving to rescind the roadless rule on U.S. national forests, citing wildfire management needs. However, new research indicates that roads are actually associated with increased fire occurrence and severity in many forest types. Although this remains a U.S. development, Canadian practitioners supporting cross-border mining or pipeline projects should track the outcomes closely. There may be potential influence on Canadian wildfire interface planning, access road requirements, and reclamation standards. These requirements fall under provincial forestry, mining, and environmental protection rules in jurisdictions such as British Columbia, Alberta, and Ontario. From a practitioner standpoint, this serves as a reminder that policy shifts south of the border often create both risk and opportunity for Canadian projects operating under parallel environmental constraints. Separately, Google is planning a large-scale carbon capture project associated with data center operations in Nebraska. This is relevant for Canadian consultants advising clients on emerging carbon capture and storage technologies. These technologies increasingly intersect with federal CPA greenhouse gas reporting and provincial climate compliance obligations for large emitters or contaminated energy sites. An analysis from the UK shows that CO2 emissions from new data centers could be hundreds of times higher than previously estimated when full supply chain and backup power considerations are included. This has indirect implications for Canadian environmental professionals supporting data center developments north of the border. It particularly affects the accuracy of Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions calculations under both provincial and federal climate reporting requirements. The takeaway is that data center and technology sector clients will require increasingly sophisticated carbon accounting support as regulatory expectations continue to tighten. Speaking of notification and engagement in complex regulatory settings, there is an important nuance worth understanding. When petroleum spills reach navigable waters. Imagine you arrive on site at a remote pipeline right-of-way in northern Alberta after a reported diesel release that has reached a small navigable tributary. The Phase 2 ESA confirms free product in the near-shore sediment, and you are now responsible for managing the immediate and longer-term regulatory response. The immediate question is not just technical containment, but who must be notified, in what order, and within what time frame under overlapping federal and provincial rules. The Fisheries Act requires immediate notification to the Department of Fisheries and Oceans for any deleterious substance release into fish-bearing waters. At the same time, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act 1999 as amended triggers separate spill reporting obligations for listed substances under the spill regulations. In parallel, the Species at Risk Act may require engagement if listed fish or critical habitat is affected. Provincial legislation such as Alberta's Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act or British Columbia's Environmental Management Act imposes additional incident reporting to the provincial spill line within strict timeframes. The experienced practitioner recognizes that the real leverage point in these situations is often the duty to consult. This includes procedural requirements under the Impact Assessment Act or provincial environmental assessment legislation when the spill triggers a federal authorization. What separates senior practitioners is the discipline of mapping the precise spill location against the most recent navigable waters schedule. to determine whether the water body is listed under the Navigation Protection Act. That single check determines whether Transport Canada must also be engaged. They also maintain a pre-vetted list of Indigenous groups whose traditional territory overlaps the spill site. Early, transparent notification before full delineation often prevents later procedural challenges and accusations of inadequate consultation. The most common mistake practitioners make is treating the federal spill report as sufficient engagement and delaying contact with potentially affected First Nations until after regulatory agencies have been fully briefed. The practical fix is straightforward. Make the initial call to the relevant Indigenous communities within the same 24-hour window as the regulatory notification. Provide only factual location and substance information while offering to share further details once available. This single step significantly reduces the likelihood of subsequent regulatory delays, legal challenges, or reputational damage. Here are your action items for today. If you are working on projects in Ontario's Ring of Fire region, review your project files to determine whether the federal IA interim report findings require updates to existing environmental assessments or permitting strategies. For those with current BC clients holding climate-related compliance obligations under Clean BC, identify those files and assess how the agency restructuring may affect reporting contacts, data requests, and timelines. Update your spill response templates to explicitly include the dual federal-provincial notification pathways and Indigenous notification considerations for releases reaching navigable waters. Brief your mining and pipeline clients on the procedural implications of provincial non-participation in federal impact assessments. Incorporate atmospheric deposition considerations and appropriate background sampling protocols into upcoming forested site assessments. Looking at the week ahead. Ongoing monitoring of the Ontario government response to the Ring of Fire interim report is essential for any formal provincial position or consultation announcement. Track Federal Impact Assessment Agency next steps on the Ring of Fire process following release of the First Nations-led interim report. March 31, 2026 marks Standard Provincial Contaminated Sites annual reporting deadlines, approaching in several jurisdictions for active remediation sites. April 2026 will see anticipated federal carbon pricing adjustments and associated provincial alignment filings for large emitters. Before we wrap, tomorrow we will have more on the evolving federal-provincial coordination challenges in major project assessments. That's environmental intelligence for today. If this briefing is useful to your practice, share it with a colleague and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. We're back tomorrow. Have a productive day. This podcast is curated by Patrick, but generated using AI voice synthesis of my voice using ElevenLabs. The primary reason to do this is I unfortunately don't have the time to be consistent with generating all the content and wanted to focus on creating consistent and regular episodes for all the themes that I enjoy, and I hope others do as well.